Welcome to this real-world project management webinar. Today we are joined by Josh Ramirez, Director of the Institute for Neuro and Behavioural Project Management. Josh has joined us all the way from America. It's very early in the morning, so thank you, Josh, for logging in and sharing this two-part series with us. Today is the concluding part of this series, Redesigning Project Management Around the Brain. The webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This will consist of 30 minutes of knowledge share, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. So if you have any questions during the webinar, please do drop these down in the chat and we will address these at the end. So without further ado, I'm pleased to hand you over to Josh.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me fine. So welcome to Redesigning Project Management Around the Brain, Part 2. Part 1, we kind of covered some basics and got into just the overall concept. This part we'll kind of be bringing it into how we start applying behavioral and neuroscience in kind of a way of processes and skills, interfaces, etc. So I kind of view this as the next dimension of project management, and we'll get into that a little bit more. First of all, I hope everyone's doing well considering the issues going around the world right now, but I guess we can take advantage of this by learning a little bit more while some of us are working from home, etc. So I hope all is well in Europe from over here across the pond. So when we look at project management from the perspective of human behavior and we consider neuroscience and the brain, what we're learning is that humans aren't necessarily as purely rational and logical as we sometimes assume we are. And there's a lot of science to back this up in behavioral economics, behavioral finance, neuromarketing, etc. So there's a lot of research. And what we find is that when we look at project management through the lens of the brain, really as an information processor, this is really the core drivers of both technical and non-technical processes that we use on a project. And the impact is quite large. It's estimated that approximately 70% of performance on a project is really due to the human factor in a project, and only about 30% are technical. So if we understand how the brain works, essentially we can understand how to redesign processes to account for that. So just kind of a refresher from part 1, if we look at the brain in terms of a information processor, kind of like a computer, we find that there are several common components or elements that the brain has that compared to like a computer, for example. Both have inputs, both have memory, both have processing, and both have outputs. And so if we look at the brain in terms of data versus decisions, the brain, when it comes to processing, is really processing the next decision we'll make, whether it be in projects or operations or whatever the case may be. So compared to the computer, a computer makes logical, objective, and unbiased processing, while the brain tends to be a little bit more biased, is kind of more grounded in self-preservation, and has kind of belief systems that may or may not be logical. So while project management is kind of focused on data, what we have to work towards now is it's not just the data that comes into processing, but it's also the decisions that are made on that data. So if we're looking at project management from the perspective of the brain, there are a lot of different disciplines that we can pull from that span across the phases of projects. We can look at cognitive biases, heuristic, which are mental rules of thumb. There are forecasting and prediction sciences. There are risk sciences, uncertainty sciences, social psychology, neuroscience, judgment and decision-making science, and then choice architecture, which is essentially redesigning processes and that type of thing to account for human behavior. So if we look at project management using behavioral project management, what I view in the future is that behavioral project management and project science will eventually start to feed into, as a foundational elements, into popular project management methods such as Agile, PMBOK, APM, where those methods have been built on basic knowledge areas. Now we can start plugging the science into those methods so that we can become essentially more effective based on evidence-based studies. So projects, as we know, are defined by their time constraint. The time constraint is really the thing that defines us, as in it differs us from operations in that we're a temporary endeavor to deliver a product or service. So this is kind of one of the defining pieces in behavioral project management, and that is that the time constraint really changes the way the brain processes information. Essentially what it does is it sort of blows through the time gates, or I should say phase gates, of processing in terms of evaluating risk, evaluating predictions, etc., in planning. And so what happens is the brain is processing things faster, and it skips through some of those things that it needs to process in order to make good decisions. It also increases the use of biases, increases reliance on habits or heuristics, and it results in premature decisions. So this can have an effect of essentially reducing training and coaching, reduced creativity, increases in decision errors, increases in biases, sometimes increases in risky decision making, and even sometimes changes in trust, ethics, and governance. There's also research on optimism, and as we know, many of our projects are planned optimistically. And so research has found that we actually view the world in a more positive light than sometimes it really is. And when we're planning and forecasting and making predictions, we can often fill in the blanks with optimistic outcomes. So about 80% or more of the population tends to be more optimistic than pessimistic. Also, confirmation bias has been found in neuroscience. And confirmation bias is essentially humans tend to focus on and seek information that confirms what we already believe. So if we believe, for example, a project will finish on time, regardless of the evidence to support that, confirmation bias in the brain essentially goes and looks for information that proves that we are right. There's also research out there on prediction in the brain, and as we know in APM, which uses the word prediction a lot in the APM BOK, we find that there's prediction that's been, or predictive elements that have been identified in the brain as well. So on the bigger picture, beyond just behavioral and neuroscience, and which was a surprise to me years ago when I started doing the research, was that we don't have a scientific foundation under project management. But that's okay because the science is already being built out there. There's a couple of decades of science that we can start to apply in project management today. Now we just have to aggregate it into one spot and start applying it and using it across the spectrum of project management methodologies. And this is really a big piece for me because when you look at the science and you look at evidence-based studies that have been shown to make projects more effective, when we start applying that globally, we can start impacting projects in a major way. Now, if you guys wanted to just go out there and see what's out there just as kind of a, hey, what is project management doing in the scientific world? I mean, you can go to Google Scholar right now and go type in, for example, project management and put it in quotes. You'll get over 1 million results. That's a lot of scholarly articles that mention project management. There are also other domains that we can apply or do apply to project management found in behavioral economics, the judgment and decision-making sciences, for example. And you can go and plug that into Google Scholar and you're going to find thousands of articles. So the science already exists out there. We just have to aggregate it. This is just one example. So, and I wrote this slide months ago. I think it's even more relevant today considering the health issues that we have in the world right now. But I believe this is more relevant today because if we can become more effective at predicting our projects and more effective at delivering them through science, essentially we can improve human health and the planet through projects. And so I believe this is a critical piece, is bringing science into project management so that we become essentially faster at making high quality solutions sooner. So if we were to look at and compare the PMBOK, for example, this is kind of the way I view the missing pieces in traditional project management. For example, in the PMBOK, we might have a process flow that says, go and plan your scope, identify your risk, estimate durations, etc. Those are kind of flat, one-dimensional processes in that it doesn't account for the errors that may be occurring in the human brain. So if we look at mental processes that occur prior to the estimate being formulated and communicated, for example, we might see things like the anchoring effect that changes how we process the needs for the project. And then that anchoring effect essentially is changing the estimate that is formulated before we even communicate that or put it into a plan. And so if we can start accounting for those mental processes before they're communicated, essentially what we're doing is looking at the brain like a computer, and we're ensuring that all the calculations and all the influences on the brain are more well aligned to account for behavioral errors. So we looked at project science a few minutes ago. Here is an example, and this is where we really start talking about redesigning project management around the brain. If we take evidence-based studies and say, okay, someone has done research in planning and forecasting and determined that if we do something a certain way, we actually get a more accurate plan. So Roger Buehler, who does a lot of research in planning and forecasting and from the behavioral perspective, did research to find out, okay, well, if I ask questions a certain way or use certain words, will I get a different or more accurate outcome? This is one example of applying project science to develop a new process. So one of the examples is that he found is if you ask someone or project manager or someone who's making a project prediction, if you ask them to identify the obstacles associated with that activity prior to asking them to estimate how long it will take, people plan more accurately. This is just one example. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of more scientific articles out there that have found similar processes where we can go and take that new evidence-based approach and put it into our processes. And if we're redesigning project management around the brain, this is just one example. So this is what I was talking about here. Essentially, we have a new behavior-informed project process design. If we were to look at it from the perspective of the PMBOK, right now we only have sequence activities, estimate resources, and then estimate duration. But according to Roger Buehler's study, if we were to take that evidence-based research and plug it into the PMBOK, this is what we would get. We would get a new process that says, identify obstacles prior to estimating resources. And that's just one example. So if we take science and we apply it at a very large spectrum across project management, these are kind of the four major modalities that I see things falling into in terms of pulling the science in and applying it to project management. And it's more than just teaching us skills, for example. It's redesigning processes to account for how the brain operates. It's formulating metrics so that we measure human factors with project factors. Sometimes it's designing interfaces around the way humans think, which means you might change your processes in your software or how your software operates to get better decision making. And then, of course, the last piece is skills. So we had the example of identify obstacles that we just discussed in a couple slides ago. This is how something might look in terms of taking that new science-based process and applying it across the modalities. One, insert identify obstacles before estimate durations in your process. Take that same study and say, okay, measure optimism bias in correlation to obstacles identified. In other words, you're going to go take and apply it to metrics. You're going to add obstacles as an activity option in scheduling software, for example. And then from the skills portion, we might train to ask about obstacle planners that are typically obscure. So sometimes the obstacle may be obscure and you may not see it, but if you start asking about it and you list, you might get different responses and you may be able to increase the accuracy of your plan. And then in the planning and prediction piece, there's further research that shows that things like visualization, for example, if we can see that there are realities in predictions, we often are more realistic in our predictions. Providing routine feedback to your forecasters on the accuracy of their predictions increases planning and forecasting accuracy. Awareness, so reduce thinking errors through awareness, is essentially because people tend to self-monitor. So if they know that they have a tendency to have specific cognitive biases, they will often try to mitigate those themselves. And then, of course, the active measures, which are intention. We all have essentially conscious and unconscious intentions that drive behavior. And so this is just yet another example of how we can increase accuracy in project prediction using behavioral neuroscience. And obviously, this is a very high level. It doesn't go into depth. So behavioral project management. It's not completely new in that what we're doing is essentially benchmarking off of other disciplines. Behavioral economics and behavioral finance have already been doing this for over a decade at least. And that's essentially applying research from human behavior and neuroscience and applying that to economics and finance. So if we were to benchmark off of behavioral economics, for example, we can start seeing that there are ways to plug this into project management to create behavioral project management. And I just included this slide. This is some of the things that we're doing, some of our researchers involved in terms of applying the science to projects. So behavioral economics, as we were referencing just a second ago, has already started to make its way across the world. And this is one example. There are institutions everywhere now that are applying behavioral insights to public policy, for example. And this is a map that just shows how behavioral insights groups are growing across the world. So for you personally, or even for your organization, how does this apply? In terms of outcomes, I think, I don't just think, I know it's going to have an increased on-time project delivery, higher project management organizational competency, definitely reduced risk for both whether internally or for your client because of the way humans view risk or avoid risk at times. Fusing essentially a full spectrum of human competencies in your projects. This goes far beyond emotional intelligence or leadership or motivation, which is kind of more the feeling side of behavioral science, but now incorporating the thinking or cognitive side of behavioral science as well. And then obviously through reduced risk and increased on-time project delivery, we get increased customer trust and project outcomes. And then my favorite is organizations that start to use behavioral project management and science becoming leaders in advanced project management. So this is what I see as the next big steps for innovative organizations as we start to pull the science, both broad science and behavioral science, into project management. These are kind of long-term visions, developing a college of project science versus project management at a university. Full adoption of a behavioral project management at a PMO, we're calling it a behavioral PMO. Government agencies implementing the science. And then adopting science-based planning, which is designed around our brains. So I like to ask the question, will we look back at our discipline 20 years from now and say, wow, we were living in a flat, one-dimensional project world today? Because we're really only beginning to scratch the surface of what's available and what's out there, and it's a matter of now just aggregating it and applying it. So after our presentation here today, if you guys want to go to nbpmi.com, here's an example of some of our tabs from our website. So you can go and explore there. One other piece that we're working on is essentially mapping some of the cognitive biases to the PMBOK and other methodologies. So there's a lot of work yet to do, And here's just a few of us that are working on it. And then, of course, we're also working on a science-based planning approach, which is designed around the brain. We're calling that NeuroPlan, which will be under the NPPQ certification. So that's kind of a work in progress right now. I'm hoping sometime this year we'll start training for that. So at a very high level, and this is kind of my long-term vision and dream, is that really neuro and behavioral project management is the science of delivering dreams, because every project is a temporary endeavor. Every project is someone's dream or long-term vision, whether it be to deliver something for a major organization or deliver something personally that you're working on. And if we become more effective at that, applying evidence-based studies, essentially we can accelerate the progress of humanity, and we can accelerate projects that deliver those dreams. The last piece that I kind of wanted to draw a comparison to, in the project management world right now, we rely on computers and software a lot. We do a lot in data. So we have a lot of data science. We put tons of effort into this, in some cases millions, if not billions. We haven't spent very much time on the decision science part, because data by itself is nothing unless we're making a decision with it. And so it goes back to how humans process information. So we've put tons of effort into data, but how much have we put into decisions? We spent billions on data, but what percentage of our budgets in our organizations and universities and governments are here in decisions? We keep our data processors updated, but how much do we do in updating our decision processors, i.e., accounting for how humans think? We design organizations around data, but I haven't seen as many designed around decisions. We have lots of QA on data, but how much QA do we have on the science of decisions? We write processes for data, but do we write processes for accounting for human decisions? And the biggest piece is that data really only shows us performance, but decisions actually change performance. And I think that's where the big impact will be in project management, is if we take the behavioral science and neurosciences as a collective decision science and account for the way the brain thinks and behaves, we can actually change the performance of a project versus just monitoring it. And so here's my contact information. If anyone wants to go out there, there's the website. You can reach me on my email there. I'm also on LinkedIn and Twitter, and the Institute is also on Facebook.
Thank you, Josh. That was brilliant. Wrapping up after the first part of the series. Got some questions come through already. If you have any other questions to the attendees that are currently listening, please do pop these down in the chat box now. So I'll start with Maria. She said, can we get access to the slides after the webinar? The webinar is always recorded, so this will be uploaded to YouTube. Josh, would you be happy to share these slides with me so I can pass these out to our attendees?
Yes, I would highly advise to watch the recording in lieu of the slides, as you may not have the context associated with it, but yes, I can definitely share those slides.
Perfect, thank you. Ram has said, brilliant webinar. So that's a little bit of feedback. I do remember Ram was at the beginning part of this series, part 1 and part 2.
Thank you.
Martin Faulkner says, are you researching the influence of personality?
There are some studies out there on personality. I do not put a lot of focus on that yet because it is kind of next level down in the WBS, so to say. So right now we're really focusing on those broad behavioral patterns that impact everyone, but I do see that there will be research in the future for personalities.
Thank you. So we've got a question here from Jack. He said, often optimism biases is applied externally from clients, sponsors and investors. How do you, as a project manager or planner, overcome this? Is it to list the obstacles so that the stakeholders account for them?
So that's known as strategic misrepresentation, i.e. lying sometimes. Yes, we see that a lot. That becomes kind of, in some cases, an organizational and cultural issue because if it's across the spectrum, it's kind of like throwing darts at a steel wall, right? So when we've experimented sometimes with applying other methods that would reduce optimism bias, strategic misrepresentation tends to sometimes be resistant to that. The first big thing is essentially showing the issues associated with optimistic output. So in those cases, you need to do as much as you can to reveal risk and obstacles before they're shown to the client, for example. Because if you can fill in the blanks, then what you do is you force the person to face the issues. And in things like elements like cognitive dissonance, for example, cognitive dissonance is the two conflicting values or beliefs that we hold when we're introduced to new information, and when we can either accept it, reject it, minimize it, or discredit it. And so strategic misrepresentation can sometimes be more easily combated by forcing the person to see the obstacles and risks that would create that optimistic output, because then they have to make a decision. So in that case, if I knew in advance that the client tend to be more leaning towards the strategic misrepresentation piece, I would want to come to them with as much information that would show that having that optimistic plan is in fact almost impossible to meet, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Josh. Jamie has asked, would asking for the obstacles before the activities make situations any better?
Yes, I would even recommend sometimes adding activities that are associated with the obstacles. If you think of obstacles almost like an obstacle course, so to say, if you look across an obstacle course, you can see the hurdles that you have to go over in order to get to your milestone. I would almost, in some cases, add an activity that represented the obstacles. It's important to note that you want to ask about it before you start estimating how long something will take. So whether you ask about the obstacles prior to breaking down the scope or post breaking down the scope, make sure that you're doing that before you estimate durations.
Thank you. Right, so next question we have from Scott. He said, do you have any common themes or approaches when identifying then managing obstacles?
I guess I'm not quite understanding that question.
Scott, could you elaborate further? I guess what he's trying to get is, if we identify a common theme, how would we then manage the obstacles that we've identified?
A common theme. A common theme in the project, for example?
That's what it looks like. Do you have any common themes or approaches when identifying and managing obstacles? Is there sort of a certain way you would manage an obstacle that tends to reappear over time?
Maybe he's talking about the approach of using obstacle identification.
Perhaps.
In which case I would say the one thing that keeps coming to mind in my experience is that when I've used obstacle identification, people often go to the category of risk. And so they'll often interchange risk and obstacles commonly. And what I have to explain is that those are two totally different things. So this is kind of a common thing that I see coming up all the time, because we're so used to talking about risk. When we hear obstacles, we're like, okay, yeah, so risks. No, so risks are things that may or may not occur. And obstacles are those things that will occur. Why is this so important? Because the way humans process risk is that we look at it through the lens of kind of just cover your face and hope that it doesn't occur. So if we don't acknowledge a risk, essentially we can say, well, it may or may not occur, so I'm going to choose to say that it won't occur if we're optimistic. If I ask about an obstacle, I'm saying that thing will occur, in which case now I have to plan around it and I have to become more realistic and I have to have mitigations for that obstacle. If I say, well, it's a risk, then I can make a choice to say, well, I'm just going to assume that it won't occur. So I'm not sure if that answers his question specifically, but that's one of the common themes that I've seen coming up in obstacle identification.
Thank you. Scott has typed in and said that answers his question, and thanks for your response.
Perfect.
Next up is Andrew. He says, have you considered cultural impacts and differences? Example, does a degree of optimism vary between different countries?
So I haven't done much research on different countries, but I do know that there is research out there on different countries and cultures. I do know that organizational cultures for specific organizations, yes, that can be very relevant at times. One example is a term called organizational silence. So organizational silence tends to be or represents kind of people's resistance to talking about issues that are occurring or risks that are occurring in the organization. The recent Boeing example, and I forget the exact name of the nomenclature of the plane, but that was one example of organizational silence. There were issues that were going on, but people were not willing to talk about them. So organizational silence can also contribute to things like strategic misrepresentation and optimism, in that we may know that there's a risk or an obstacle that could prevent the project from performing well, but no one's willing to talk about it. This is a very cultural issue in that the whole organization takes part in this lack of communication for whatever reason. And a lot of times that may be associated with management and leadership.
Great, thank you. We've got a question here from Merv. He said, lessons learned in projects is rarely done well. How can the behavioural and/or neuroscience improve the process and the impact it has on future project performance?
So first piece of this is the organizational silence piece, right? That's just one example. If you have a culture that does not like to talk about its risk or obstacles, you're not going to get very honest lessons learned. Another piece is the availability heuristic. So the availability heuristic explains how humans tend to only remember those things that happen repetitively. For example, it happens so many times that we can't forget. Those things are emotionally relevant. So something occurred that really caused an emotional memory to occur. And very large and extreme events. But the problem is that as we go through the project and the longer the project is, when comes time to do lessons learned, if we don't realize that the availability heuristic is going to impact our memory of those events, what we do is we tend to not put them in our lessons learned. And so if we can plan around the availability heuristic, it might look like something in terms of how often or frequent you start documenting your lessons learned and then compiling those at the end. And that's just one example.
That's great, thank you. We've got quite a large question here from Ian, but a very thought-provoking one. He said that in his experience in construction projects, people are most naturally pessimists who decide on the bias of what is best for their career. So they'll either usually do the minimum or do nothing. The rest of the 30% are more optimistic risk takers who like making decisions on the bias of limited information. He said neither has the ideal behaviour pattern that we would advocate. How can we train people to move away from their traditional decision-making pattern and spend time thinking on making better optimum decisions?
Wow, that's a very loaded and broad question, but a good one. Well, there's going to be a lot of dynamics, and this is both has to do with individual behavior as well as organizational behavior. But one of the first things I would say is that you need a balance of approaches. And what we find as part of the big contributors to cognitive biases, for example, is a lack of perspectives and outside information. So while the optimist tends to look at things through an optimistic view and the pessimist tends to look at things from a pessimistic view, neither one of those are realistic. But if your organizational culture and your thinking doesn't support in taking outside perspectives, you'll never get the full picture of what's going on the project. So it's a very good question, but it has a lot of complicated answers. That's just one piece of it.
One fragment. It's such a broad question, but really, really thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Brian has asked, how do you change the mindset of clients who have a completion date in mind but have no science applied?
This goes back to the strategic misrepresentation piece. In a sense, it kind of has the same answer, and once again, these are very broad and overarching answers to some of these questions, but it has kind of the same approach in terms of showing them the risk and obstacles associated with the project. And oftentimes, what we do is we just take their date and we try to plan around it and and not give them some of the issues that would cause the plan to go awry. What we have to do then as a planning team is we have to go back and uncover all of those things, and that takes time. And sometimes we're not willing to put that time into it, but what we have to do is kind of future forecast into the far future and say, what's it going to be like if we don't identify these issues now? Because then we can become optimistic internally as a project team and say, well, we're just going to have to make it and deliver it for the client. But the other thing too is while you're going back to the drawing board and finding out what issues and obstacles are associated with the project that would keep it from being delivered on time, you actually discover mitigations for those in the process. And with those, you can start to have a more productive conversation with the client where you can say, I understand your issues here. I understand you want to get this done by this date, but here are the things that we have found that would prevent that from happening. However, because we went through this process, we were actually able to identify ways to mitigate that and increase the probability of success.
Thank you, Josh. Kevin has asked, how does the research indicate that the role of individual affects decision science in project management, for example, in senior or executive roles?
So this question is more about the role?
Yeah, so how does the research indicate that the role of the individual affects decision science in project management, for example, in senior executives or sponsors? So yeah, those that are higher up decision makers.
My experience has been the pressures associated with higher management and leadership. They tend to have more interfaces with clients, external stakeholders, other decision makers that are outside of their domain, perhaps the economy at large. We get back once again, and I hate to bring this up for the third time, but once again, we find that we need more information, and managers need more information, especially if they're under pressure and they're trying to communicate with stakeholders and owners of the project. And so it really is incumbent upon the project teams to start providing data that challenges unrealistic views. Because this is one of the first ways that you can de-bias is by showing different perspectives. So I find that the roles of leadership have significantly different challenges than sometimes the project team. But in this case, we have to change how data is presented and visualized so that leaders can actually see the right data versus just plain data. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Josh. Kevin has added that senior execs are more likely to be affected by peer pressure and suffer from considering themselves highly educated.
Yes, yes. And this goes kind of to a part we really didn't discuss a lot, is that as we start looking more to behavioral science to inform decision making in projects, the way we show data and what data we show will actually change a lot. So it's not so much that, oh, just give me more data. Behavioral science will show us that we need to strategically display certain data.
Perfect, thank you. I've got 2 more questions and just over 10 minutes left, so if you have any more questions, please put these in. David has said, project managers are often responsible for project delivery, but are often not in direct control of project outputs. By this, he means that project managers need to get teams of professionals to deliver outputs, but often a project has a resistor or a project saboteur. What's the best way to manage this person from a behavioural scientific perspective to limit the project failure?
Oh, this is a good one. It's actually one of the challenges that I've been thinking about a lot recently, because as I've worked with some projects, I've seen that they have subcontractors that they have no control over, and so the subcontractors are giving them information that is skewing their results. The biggest thing that comes to mind so far is getting those people on board early in the process as part of the team. Humans tend to be biased towards their own groups, whether it's political group, whether it's project group, it doesn't matter. If we identify with a group, we tend to be biased with that group. One of the ways to break down some of those biases is drawing other in-groups from out-groups. So for example, if I am an engineer and I meet a non-engineer, I might find that they also identify with another group that I identify with that's outside of engineering. So for example, we might have the same baseball team or something like that. So if we can find in-groups in those out-groups and start seeing other team members as more human instead of being just purely outside of us, we can actually develop the teamwork between subcontractors, for example, or other groups that are working externally to the project, but that we rely on. But we need to get ahead of that early on in the project versus waiting till an issue comes up. Because by that time, people are now anchored to old information via the anchoring effect, for example. They're anchored to old information about that person, and now they're going to reference that through the remaining of the project. So it's important to get those external groups on board early in the process to avoid some of that anchoring effect, avoid some of that in-group bias early on. Sometimes when it comes to things like saboteurs, for example, some of those things are not going to be something you can resolve just by changing processes or applying a simple mitigation. Some of those I think are going to be more customized or consultative endeavors, so to say. It's a very complicated piece, very, very complicated piece.
Thanks, Josh. We'll finish on our last question from Ian. Do you think that all key decisions should be tested with other people? A total autocrat may seem decisive, but will inevitably regularly make suboptimal decisions.
Yes. Yes, I think all decisions should be tested. And this becomes part of an organizational cultural thing, because similar to issues like organizational silence, if the organization as a whole tends to socially disregard external inputs, information from the team, etc., you have a cultural issue you have to change. But that takes a little bit of a collective process. Decision making should always be questioned because there's generally a bias of some sort in just about every decision. And like we discussed before, bringing in more information is kind of one of the first pieces of debiasing, because if we don't have information, we fill in the gaps with our own biases and heuristics. That's just the tendency, the way the human brain operates. When it doesn't have information, it fills in the information with current belief systems and past experiences. So once again, we're back to bringing in more information and bringing in the right information. But obviously that can't be the only solution. When you have a leader that is in charge of everyone, sometimes that's not even an option.
Thank you. We actually have had another question come through from David. He said the webinar's been very, very interesting and emphasises a lot on soft skills, which is really needed in project management. So more of a statement. We've also had another thank you from Chloe. She said that the webinar's been great. And also from Claire, she said it's very interesting, definitely worth learning more about how this influences the project.
Awesome. I would like to make one clarifying statement. Is that as we do more research from the cognitive psychology and just cognitive science perspective, I think we're going to be moving to include soft skills, but traditionally we tend to think of soft skills as kind of more feeling, right? As we move through behavioral project management, we will have both the feeling elements of cognition and the thinking elements of cognitions. So while some of it will be what we might traditionally think of as soft skills, the other side is more the redesigning processes, environments, interfaces around the brain to where we may not even be aware that we are accounting for human behavior in some of our processes, but in fact we're actually mitigating human behavior in many cases without even applying a soft skill, so to say. So it's just kind of a perspective on, as we move through into integrating behavioral science, it will include both what we've traditionally talked about in soft skills and additional elements such as choice architecture, where we will just simply design and change processes, environments to account for human behavior without even applying necessarily a interaction or a social skill in the process. So great statement. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Josh. I'll end on a statement from Kate, and she said that it's an excellent webinar, very inspirational, thank you. It's really helpful for this sort of inspiration to brighten the tiring nature of the day of project hassles. And what I'm thinking, Josh, is as you sort of further progress your research and as this grows, it would be great for us to touch base and perhaps run further webinars on this subject, as it's obviously clearly very, very much enjoyed by our members.
Oh, I appreciate it, and I would love to. I appreciate that. And thanks for everyone. Thanks to everyone for coming in and asking all the great questions as well.
Perfect. Well, stay safe and well, everybody, and thank you very much for tuning in. Josh, again, thank you for logging on so early in the morning. What time is it across in America?
It's actually not so early anymore now. It's 8:56 a.m.
Wow,
so
okay.
We're good.
That's not too bad. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all.